It's going to be some time before technology reaches the limit that supports where we are perceptually and experientially where we want to be. My expectation of being invisible won't change. It's going to be much harder to achieve, but I think the root of that complexity is going to be in the psychophysiological realm. It's the realm that's like the crossroads of understanding of how physical and emotional and logical reactions to these new interactions with light and color will come to define these new story experiences.
Senior Production Engineer and Colorist at Dolby, Shane Mario Ruggieri, CSI, joins me on this episode of the Colorist Podcast. In San Francisco during the 2000s, Shane came up through the ranks, working in all aspects of production and post-production. From the beginning of Final Cut Pro and later Apple Color, he cut his teeth on the early stages of color grading on the Mac. He's colored for features, commercial, corporate, and entertainment industries. His clients have included Apple, Sony, Netflix, Green Day, Carrie Underwood, and Universal Studios. Now working at Dolby, Shane has specialized and is one of a handful of colorists that have been working with Dolby Vision HDR since 2010. He co-authored a Perceptual EOTF for Extended Dynamic Range Imager and authored Breaking Out of the 100-Nit Box, a colorist's view of grading HDR, which were presented at SMPTE. In this podcast, we talk about how starting with SDR prepared him for working with HDR, working with Dolby Vision in Resolve, comparing HDR10 and Dolby Vision, and grading tools in HDR, and how they will change in the future. And now, here's Shane Mario Ruggieri, CSI. Well, thanks, Shane, for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so a little background on you. You work at Dolby, and I was curious to hear about how you got started as a colorist and just what your general background is.
I've really always been attracted to entertainment. I mean, I can remember back when I was 10, I'd spend most of my summer days between like the pool and the theater. I mean, I went so much back then, I think they gave me a job taking tickets for free popcorn. But in 81, I really began mixing and scratching hip hop and house music and just really got into it. I started doing that stuff in my basement and I ended up turning that into a business. So from about 13 years old to 19, I was DJ Kid Protege, and that's what really drove me to video, because back then, MTV was just getting its start, and I was like so into that music video scene and seeing them and mixing music. I wanted to mix video. I wanted to do something there, but you couldn't find equipment back then. It was so hard to find access to it. You remember the days, back
Sure.
in the days, there's just no way. I mean, what, $1 million suites? They're not accessible to a kid. Every so often I'd find places to go do, tape to tape and that kind of thing, and scrape some money together and did some small projects. But I really consider my first big break in the industry was about 2000. I was a marketing and studio manager for Studio 111 in San Francisco. That was a boutique sound and post house. And we did mostly like advertising agency stuff and Silicon Valley corporate work. Bill Bain, the director there, he gave me an opportunity. Shout out to Coyote Films. And he actually started to retire about a year later into it. I almost bought the place with a couple friends, but I didn't. And Bill actually helped me. He was probably single-handedly responsible for showing me how to run a successful freelance business. I owe him a lot for that. He gave me some perfect advice, something along the lines of, you can be a one-trick pony, or you can take the longer journey and learn how to do a bunch of stuff and then kind of ride the tides out. And that's what I did. Scripting and camera and editing and PAing, whatever the people would pay me to do, I did it because I just loved the stuff. I guess what got me started as a colorist was editorially. I was working on Final Cut Pro 1. I loved the color corrector, the three-way color corrector, and I hated seeing all this random footage look so bad. So I'd always correct my edits, and I just kind of became known as the guy who corrected his edits, kind of built a name on that a little bit. I was just amazed why more people didn't use that limit effects. Remember that little, I don't know if you remember that, but
yeah.
It's a freaking keyer right inside the the projector. So anyway, I became known as that. And so people started building in time for me to do, corrections in Final Cut. I was like, wow, this is great. And then Apple did the crazy thing of buying Final Touch, turning it to color. And man, I was just in love. And I literally started offering that to my clients instead of doing it in Final Cut. And my work doubled. I literally doubled my workflow that year. And the next year it tripled. So I was like, okay, I'm going to stop being an editor. I'm going to be a color. And I started studying color theory and history and art history and anything to help me communicate better. And that's kind of how I got into it.
Since you're at Dolby now, how long did you grade SDR before going over to Dolby. And did that experience learning the nuts and bolts of how to grade SDR, did that transfer over when you started grading HDR?
I was contracting at Dolby since about 2001, and I joined the company 2011. So it was about 10 years, depending on if you really consider the FCP work coloring. So I've been doing it about 10 years. I consider it coloring because it really gave me an understanding of how to fix footage, what to do. And in Final Cut, it was really hard to fix footage, and so I got a lot of good experience trying to put lipstick on a pig, as they'd say. And my experiences of grading did transfer over from SDR, but it was really my education that helped me the most. I'd gone to college for computer science for about 3 years, and then I changed my major to double in philosophy and law and society. So the fundamental technical side of computer science, plus learning how to think about concepts, that really prepared me for what I needed to do and how to be effective at my job. Because at Dolby, I don't know if many people know, but it's a fairly small company with a massive brain trust. There's a lot of smart people at Dolby, and trying to talk to them and fit in and trying to help them get imagery first took me to understanding what they were talking about. If you can imagine, like within 10 seconds of my front door at the studio, I've got like biovision scientists like Scott Daly. I got the undisputed father of HDR photography, Greg Ward, about another 5 seconds away. And, have you ever seen that Michael Jackson video, the black and white music video?
Uh-huh. The one with the morph.
That one where the morphing faces and all that kind of stuff. Well, the guy who wrote that software is a guy's named Thad Beyer. He was a visual effects supervisor for G.I. Joe and Fast and Furious. Well, he sits like 7 seconds away from my door. So, it was very intimidating, very intimidating.
So how did you first make your way over to Dolby?
Well, I had been contracting with those guys from about 2001 when I was working over at Fatbox as an executive producer, producing animation and motion graphics. And we had some jobs with Dolby, and so I got introduced to a couple of guys over there. And they started bringing me over for other projects as well, doing editorial, shooting, and various things like that. And so just started to build a relationship with them. And sooner or later, they brought me over and introduced me to HDR. That's back when it was 600 nits.
On the technical side, what are you currently grading with?
Oh, I mainly use Resolve. Mostly in my home studios, I use Resolve. At work, we have Scratch, we've got Baselight. In fact, most of my early work on HDR was done in Scratch. They were one of the early adopters, like 16-bit workflows and that type of thing. And they were really helpful in the early days. But now, mostly the Resolve guy.
Is there anything specific in Resolve that you find is the workflow is easier or made you choose Resolve over some of the other options that you have?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think it was one of those things where I liked how it felt. I liked what I could do, and it made sense to me. And it was also, I think part of it was that it was available, that I could buy it and own it, and prices started coming down, and places that I was going had copies. And so I think it was partially coincidence that I had access to it, and that it actually spoke to me and made a lot more sense to me than some of the other platforms. And it was easier to learn. Scratch was fun to work in. It was a lot harder to learn for me. My buddy picked it up way faster than I did, but it was a little bit more difficult for me to learn. So I'm more fluent in it,
A lot of the grading tools, too, that are built into Resolve or Scratch or Baselight or any of those, they were originally built with SDR in mind. Do you see like a different type of grading mode that's going to be specially tuned for grading in HDR?
My prediction on that is that, the whole industry is going to require some mastery in the crafting of physiological responses in the consumer. I think that's really going to drive this. And to do that well, the tools are going to need to advance in a ways that we or the tool makers don't even know yet, because we really haven't got technology to achieve and to really work in those areas in a wider scope to really get that information yet. I think what we need for the tool makers to do is invest some time to explore the possibilities and I'd say the promise of HDR. But I do have to say, the current tools we have are quite adept at making great HDR images. We can make some spectacular images today, so I'm not complaining at all. I think just as we get more advanced, the tool makers will realize it and they'll come up with things for us to do. And I think that's going to happen.
Is there ever something that you're using when you're using any of the tools that you're like, I wish I could just do this. I wish I just had the ability to do this. You know what I mean?
I do. I wish I had magic, I do sometimes like, hey, can I just make this happen?
Right.
Man, magically track this, no, you got a keyframe.
Or do what I think. Just read my mind and just do what I
Please,
think.
Siri, can you?
Right, exactly.
I have to say that as of this point, I haven't run into that quite often. I'm sure that there's moments in my life as I'm going through this going, man, I wish I could just go in there. Okay, oh yeah, there are something. I wish I could fix bad shooting.
Yeah.
Someone that underexposes something that is intended for HDR but shot for SDR. And, that's a challenge. I wish there was something that I could do. And, it's a new industry. It's a new time. And some of those lessons, even the DPs are learning. And I think the Hollywood DPs and the film guys, and the film gals that have been working in film, I think they get it in a deep way, in an intrinsic way that I don't think is necessarily there for guys like me who started in digital. I think they have an advantage in that sense.
I mean, do you think that directors and DPs are going to have to change the way that they shoot the things that they do in the future for HDR? I mean, are they going to have to do things specifically if they know they're going to do something in HDR?
I do believe that. And back in the film days, there weren't monitors to look at. They didn't have image by committee. These guys and gals were looking at the set and they understood their image capturing system and they knew where to place the light. They knew how much light needed to be there. They understood the whole process. And I think that's going to be revived, I think, through HDR too, because it's going to be necessary to understand those things. You just can't open the camera and shoot a decent image and think, okay, I'm going to be able to tell an HDR story with this.
Do you feel like there's certain subjects or genres that are well tuned to being in HDR, or do you think that any subject is open to being an HDR type of project?
I think any subject is open to it because it's about the relationship to the human. Light and interaction with a human is something that we all understand, or most of us understand. The sighted can actually experience that light in a way that affects them. And now those affectations, or if that's the proper word of using it, can be used as storytelling elements. And there's physiological reactions to those things that now can be taken into account. And, I think any genre that wants to connect to the human can use HDR. And HDR is not just about bright images. It's not just about colorful images. It's about this realm that you can use in which to tell a story. And it doesn't all have to be bright and dark. And, it's this realm and this moving through the realm.
In order to do Dolby Vision, you need to have the CMU, Content Mapping Unit. And as you said, when you were coming up, you started with Final Cut Pro. And to get into this is a pretty expensive endeavor. How long do you think this technology is going to take to filter down to indies or lower budget TV for a wider adoption?
Well, I mean, HDR is in its infancy, right? It's brand new in the scheme of things. If I can be so bold to paraphrase Rob Carroll of Dolby, I've talked about this with him, and his idea is that, all transitions in our industry, if you think about it, so remember analog to digital video and like film to DI or SD to HD, they've all had barriers. And those barriers actually fell with the wider adoption. And it took like 15 years for just the first HD images to be seen on the broadcast TV. I mean, I remember seeing HD for the first time, like, look, you can see the faces in the baseball team, like in the stands, but that was like 15 years of effort to get that first broadcast out there. And Dolby Vision is no different in that way. We want to strive to simultaneously drive down the barrier to entry and increase adoption. It's going to be something that we are trying to do, but it's going to take some time. But we are efforting to do that.
Yeah, and there's a lot of outlets for this stuff to be seen now, like Netflix or Amazon, or, it's really becoming easier to see actual HDR content too.
And it's only going to get easier, and there's going to be more places to see it. And I do believe that over time, it's going to change how we view content. It's going to interact with us in different ways, and we're going to interact with it in different ways. I personally believe it's going to change how we experience storytelling. That's what makes me excited about it.
So what is the difference between Dolby Vision and HDR10? Do you find that people have reason to choose one over another?
I would encourage you to think about the bigger picture. It's about the dynamic metadata and the control that the dynamic metadata provides over the images at all performance tiers. And what I mean by that is all different types of televisions. So right now we suffer from the Best Buy effect. We got one signal, so imagine one signal, and you're looking at 30 different TVs on the wall, and you have 30 different pictures. And guess what? Every one of those is wrong. You know why? Because the source was made in a 100 nit calibrated monitor in a controlled lighting environment, and the average LCD panel is 240 nits and some can reach up to like 1,000 nits. That's 3 to 10 times brighter than the approved images. And don't get me started on color or contrast or motion compensation or, without control over the image, you're not watching Steven Spielberg's, let's say, for example, you're not watching his story. You're watching some TV manufacturer's adaptation of Saving Private Ryan. And so HDR10, it is a subset of Dolby Vision. In fact, Dolby uses it as a base layer for the HDR Blu-rays. And for those TVs that don't offer a premium experience of Dolby Vision, well, it's perfectly good, right? But if you want the premium experience and that control over the image, then you will go with Dolby Vision and something that can play Dolby Vision back. TV manufacturers are going to continue to pump out bigger and brighter and more colorful TV sets, right? It's what the consumer wants. I think Sony just showed, 10,000 nit monitor at CES this year? And what SDR and HDR10, what they lack really are the ability to give the content creators control to show their content as they want it to be seen. So I'd say ask yourself as a content creator, do you want your content to be seen the way you tell the story? Or are you okay with maybe one set of parameters applied at, say, the TV level with no input from you as a creative? Do you want that? Or do you want your program to be chosen and say, well, at 600 nits, I want it to look like this. And at 100 nits, I want to make these choices because I know it's not going to be a 10,000 nit version. There's no way of getting that experience of 10,000 nits on a 100 nit scale or even at a 500 nit scale, which is the average HDR TV today. So the content creator has choice with Dolby Vision to say, okay, well, at 600 nits, I'm going to push more saturation and drop the contrast here and maybe create a little bit more highlight blowout because it's going to give me that punch that I see over here at 10,000 nits. And at 100 nits, I may push more saturation and lift the blacks to get more content, knowing that I'm not going to get the contrast, but maybe I show more of the image to better tell the story in that way. I think that we need to understand that you're not going to get the same response and reactions from 100 nits up to 4,000 and 10,000 nits. And that's not a problem. It just defines the premium experience. And with Dolby Vision, you actually get the control of it as it goes down to the lower premium tiers and across all performance televisions. And HDR10 doesn't offer that. And SDR doesn't offer that. So is it better? Yeah, it doesn't have the control. Dolby Vision does have the control.
So the idea of this, too, is that the HDR grade is your primary grade and the SDR grade is your secondary grade. So everything has to start from this, high dynamic range image and then filter down.
But I wouldn't call it a secondary grade. I don't mean to interrupt, but I wouldn't call the SDR the secondary grade. I would call it the 100 nit experience. It's just as important today as it ever was. And what the HDR does, it just gives you a new level of interaction with your content and your media. When you start, just like if you started with an HD source and you went to SD, you end up with a better SD source because of oversampling and these other reasons. Well, just like when you're working in HDR as your master grade, you make choices, you work with content, you see the content in its full glory, you make better choices, you make better contrast ratio choices in those moments, and you drive that image as well as you can into that range. And what that does is as you map down with the Dolby Vision process, it keeps that contrast, it helps you, and it gives you control over that contrast. And you end up with better decisions at that 709, that 100 nit 709. And that's my experience. And a lot of experience from people that are working in Dolby Vision today, a lot of the colorists say, they like their 709s better when they come from a Dolby Vision master. That just comes from experience. Sure, I can go one off and grade my SDR and say, I can get a better thing. It's like, well, yeah, maybe at 100 nits, but now show it at 200 nits. Now show it at 400 nits. Now show it at 800 nits because that's how people are watching it.
Do you find it difficult to actually create an SDR grade when you've been so used to looking at all the imagery in HDR?
Not now.
And that just comes from experience with it, or?
It does come from experience with it. But not only that, but conceptually, if you're working in an SDR mode, and this is something that I've talked to other colorists about, and it's a commonality that we all share, and if you're working in an SDR mode, you've got a cap. of how bright you have to work in, right? So imagine a luminance arc. So you've got a day scene. So you look at your show, you're like, well, I got a day scene, and then I got a night scene, then I've got an indoor scene, and I've got this other beach scene, right? And so then you look at that whole show and you say, well, my arc has to have room for this. I want the beach scene to be the most pronounced, the most impactful. So I need to lower everything else down. And so then you may take that beach scene, and if there's no real big highlights in that, you may actually lower the overall peak brightness in that beach scene. And what does that do to your overall story? It actually lowers that overall dynamic range in that 100 nit realm. And so you start to make these decisions and these choices. So when you're working in HDR, when that is much higher and much greater, you actually, in my experience, that you actually take advantage of that as you map down. You actually take advantage of that space, that SDR space, a little bit better. And people say, wow, I didn't realize you could actually push SDR that far. I just didn't push SDR that far. And you get those comments over time. And I'm not saying that's everybody's experience, but it definitely is an experience that is common amongst people that I've talked to.
We probably should define the difference, too, between grading for home video or for cinema as well, because those two environments, they're going to provide much different experiences as well.
Oh, for sure. Well, technically, in video, you're grading at an effective contrast range of 100 nits to 0.5. I think that's about the right way of looking at it, or about, 200 to 1. In Dolby Cinema, it's 108 nits and a 0.0001. So, right? So what is that? Just above 1,000,000 to 1 contrast ratio? And there's other laser projector systems out there. I think Barco has one and IMAX has one, but I think the best one next to the Dolby Cinema is like 8,000 to 1 contrast ratio. I mean, nowhere close to the Dolby Cinema. And the color range. I mean, the Dolby Cinema has full Rec 2020 color. Full Rec 2020. It's laser projected. There's no more, used to make little, butterflies on the screen. You can't do that now, right? When there's no light, there's no light.
Well, yeah, that's the big takeaway from it, is that they control how dark that room can get. And when you're talking about home TV or anything like that, who knows how bright the actual room is?
Absolutely. And we're looking into those kind of things as far as like ambient light. We're looking into that and trying to help out the panel manufacturers to create a great product. Now, imagine that you're working in the Dolby Cinema. And I just did a project recently called 88 Cents with director Tyler Penna. One of the early scenes that we worked on it was like the first night out of our protagonist's release from prison, right? And he gives away his 88 cents, that's where the story gets his name, to a homeless guy who's sitting next to a tree, kind of like shrouded in the shadows of this tree. But he's also surrounded by these super bright lights of the night of the city. Right? So basically kind of saying like he's invisible to the bright lights. And this is kind of what ultimately happens to the protagonist. And so we worked really, really hard to show like this descent from bright hope into dark and kind of slowly fading out in plain sight amongst these bright lights. And with Dolby Cinema, the massive low end that we had to work with, it was such an ease to really say, okay, I can make differences in 2 night scenes. I can make one feel much more crunchy and much more deep and dark, even though I'm not going above, 20 nits on either one of them, or even 5 nits on either one of them, because there's such a nice bottom end to expose the levels of darkness. It's really powerful. And until you kind of see it and work in it, you're like, well, it's dark, it's bright. And it's like, no, man, it's not. It's like you can get the subtlety to that really, really sells that, or hold off and dropping those lights very, very low and then push up the light to create a reaction in someone. And the realm is it's a very interesting and a very freeing realm to work in.
When you're starting any of these projects, do you feel like they need to be set up any differently for working in HDR other than the technical things that you need for Dolby Vision? Do you work in ACES? Do you have a color managed workflow, or how do you prefer to work?
Each system, and I can kind of talk about the various systems, each system has its own workflow to do HDR, and they take advantage of the Dolby Vision SDK, and they're going to deploy it in a way that best fits that platform. But basically what I like to do when I'm setting up for HDR is I tend to work in a PQ space. I want to work in that, and the tools in Resolve do a really good job of responding, once you're set up. So for instance, in Resolve, I engage the color management, right? The Resolve color management, rather than just defaulting to the YRGB. And I also engage the HDR processing on the nodes. As a node level, there's that kick on HDR that also helps with processing the extended range of clips and helps the tools work better. One of the things that I changed for HDR, which I didn't expect to change, was the sensitivity on my panels. I used to have a pretty, on the resolve side, 30, 50, and some. I actually made that much more sensitive, sometimes down to 15, because I found that the fine tuning is such a huge benefit on the Dolby Vision side, especially in the cinema side, on the Dolby Cinema grades. I mean, you have such good control when you open up the sensitivity, increase the sensitivity on your panels. So I have worked in ACES. I think there's some positives about it, and I think there's some challenges with it that they're still working out. But overall, it's a great system.
So what cameras do you normally come across when you're working in HDR? Is there any specific camera that's worked really well for you, or other cameras that are problematic? Or
I remember something that Bill Bain, the guy who put me into business, he told me something when I asked him about, hey, what camera should I buy? I remember asking him, what should I buy? And he looked at me and he goes, if you're thinking about the camera, you're not thinking about the story. Start with the story, and that'll tell you what camera you need, right? So if you think about it and you apply his advice to HDR, what's most important is the story, right? And by arranging the scenes to kind of work into a dynamic range arc, and then that arc has to maximize the audience reactions. If you're doing that, you're telling the story better. And so once you establish the arc of the story and you've kind of worked out the reactions that you're after, how many stops do you need to get those reactions is the question. And then you can answer what camera can capture that range, and then you have to also, how do we light for that? And so it's not just about the individual camera. You just have to keep in mind when you're choosing a camera system, you need to take into account the low light performance. Also, its bright luminance color fidelity. So, not all cameras with big dynamic ranges capture saturated and accurate colors at high luminance values. They just don't. And you can see that, and that affects how you deal with that. If it's on the upper end of your capture and you've got to work on it, all of a sudden you got breakup, right? And you have to track that object or whatever, and it makes it harder to work with. So I think people confuse HDR with brightness, and they equate a small dynamic range of capture as unsuitable. And I say, well, if it's shot well and it's shot with intention of being kept in a smaller dynamic range, let's say they're not going to do a story that's going to have anything brighter than 100 nits, well, then 10 stops is perfectly good. You don't need to have 14 stops if you're purposely making that image. And DPs, they can capture those images if they're made aware of how the end result is going to be mastered and how it's going to be pushed in. If they're surprised by it, they're saying, "Oh, we're going to HDR," which is sometimes what happens. We get in like, "Well, I didn't shoot it for HDR. I didn't plan it for that." I would just say that the takeaway is it's not always about the camera's dynamic range. It's about the story that you want experienced, and then how do you employ the tech to capture it?
How do you think that when people shoot specifically for HDR, do you think it's going to change lighting or art direction or makeup or any of those things that we kind of have taken for granted in SDR space? How is that really going to impact things once they say the HDR grade is our primary grade and that's how the whole thing should look?
I definitely think it's going to change, if for no other reason, to overcome the challenges of moving efficiently and quickly on purpose. Just supporting HDR storytelling, it's going to challenge pre-production and lighting and art and makeup departments to add to, their body of tricks, kind of add to and push what's possible, and because they're going to have to do that to support the new techniques that HDR creates. I think we're also going to create like these new terms, like on-set terms, to communicate setups. For example, like C47s, it's a clothes hanger. Why do we call it a C47, But we're going to, I think as an industry, to do these things fast and to really do them effectively, we're going to come up with nicknames. For example, one of the things that we created was called a Thomas, right? We call it a Thomas. And it's a nickname for a pattern of luminance that creates a specific type of adaptation reaction in a person's eye. And I named it a Thomas because I was the one who came up with it. And because I was talking to my buddy Thomas at Dolby when I made it up and we were talking about it, I'm like, oh, wow, I'm going to call this a Thomas. He's like, what? Because those are the kind of things to say, like when you're on set, you're going, hey, guys, we're going to do a Thomas. And then, half the crew already knows the general parameters. Oh, I got to get these kind of lights. I need these kind of things. And then they can ask questions like, well, how long for this stage of the Thomas are we going to have this light? And how dark are we going to go? How bright are we going to go afterwards and bringing the light back up? Those kind of things are going to change But I don't think overall I think it's just going to develop and grow. The industry's always growing. HDR is just going to add some growth in some new directions.
I would think that they would maybe spray things on, like, let's say you have a knife or a sword, something that gives it a little bit more of like a glimmer or something like that, so that you can actually hit those highlights in the camera. I mean, I'm sure there's going to be all kinds of tricks in the future in production that are going to impact us in post.
Absolutely. It's going to be really fun to see this new direction and these new opportunities and new interactions. It's a new frontier. It's very cool. And we're just on the tip of the iceberg.
Oh, yeah. This is truly the beginning of it. So, being a colorist, it's all about subtlety and being invisible and just kind of making your work blend in. And with HDR, especially when you're just starting with it, the temptation to push things further than you might normally push them is very high. Do you think that we're going to enter into this time where, we're going to have really garishly bright images all over? Or do you think that people will kind of chill on it?
Well, I think bright images will come to pass. Yeah, but so will very dark images, But like today, I think the skill in maneuvering the in-between is still going to define the quality of the colorist. And I think the current limits on HDR have really yet to be close to what we want to take, where we want to take brightness. And we're far off from the 10,000 nit spec that we have, as well as the human limits of experience and nature. So, for highlights, our published studies show that the average person would prefer up to 20,000 nits for peak highlights on video. Why? I mean, that's actually a published study you can go read. The answer is because that's what real light, real world light levels are. The sun is like 1.6 billion nits, and stars are 10 to the negative ninth. Flowers in the field on a sunny day are 14,000 nits. Some of these images are on languageofhdr.com. You can go look at some of these measurements. That's kind of how I started to look at what real light ratios were. I mean, skin in sun is 9,000 nits. 9,000. And you can be outside on a beach having a conversation without sunglasses and be completely comfortable. It's all going to depend on the artist making the use of this creative space successfully. So it's going to be some time before technology reaches the limit that supports where we are perceptually and experientially where we want to be. It's going to take some time on that. My expectation of being invisible won't change. It's going to become more complex. It's going to be much harder to achieve. But I think the root of that complexity is going to be in the psychophysiological realm. It's the realm that's like the crossroads of understanding of how physical and emotional and logical reactions to these new interactions with light and color will come to define these new story experiences. It's probably the longest word I know that I can use effectively when I'm talking to people at Dolby, because they actually use it in a much more fluent way because they're studying that. Like Poppy Crum and Scott Daly and these guys, I mean, this is their realm of study, and trying to help create content for them that effectively gives them these measurable work is part of the job that I do. So I think as colorists get more experience with technology, we're going to learn to move through images and these experiences, even the jarring ones, with ease, and I think we'll still remain invisible. I hope. I think we'll be out of a job if we don't, right?
Right. So where do you think the future is headed for HDR? I know we are still kind of at the very beginning of this, but where do you see us going with this?
Well, the future's bright and it's dark. And I hope it's not always within the same frame. All right, bad joke. Because that's what people think. They think HDR is bright, and darks, I think Apple did us I don't want to call it a disservice, but when they put that HDR symbol on photography, and there's like, everybody thinks, oh, HDR, it's where you get brights and darks, right? It's like, no, that's only one type. There's like many different types of HDR experiences. To try to answer where's the future headed? So, okay, I'm going to challenge you. You ready?
Mm-hmm.
You ready for this, Josh? Okay.
I'm ready.
So imagine that you have never known anything other than a 10,000 nit TV in someone's home. Right?
Okay.
You've only ever seen that, right? It's 30 years from now, 10 years, or whatever, 10 years from now. And you've only ever seen a 10,000 nit TV, nothing dimmer than that. And you've only ever seen a 20,000 nit professional reference monitor, right? Mm-hmm. Just imagine that these are your averages, or these are your givens. And now you're a new film student. Welcome. Right? How would you go about learning to tell stories? Right? If this is your platform, you might start with maybe your own experiences and interactions with light. That's kind of what I did. You might study the reactions of humans to light. You definitely would have had hundreds of hours of entertainment that's geared to your personal sensibilities and reactions to light that's in your memory. So one of the questions I'd ask is, in that world, would the idea of normalizing light to 100 nits be more popular than making light part of the story, that we can react to it in a more familiar way? I don't think so. And so I believe one day this is going to be the colorist reality.
Right. So it's almost like your perception of the reality of what you were brought up with, too, is going to shape how the format of content gets made.
Absolutely. They're going to look back at the 100-nit stories we create now, like we do when we look back at our black and white stories of silent film time. They're going to look at, wow, it's, they appreciate it, but no doubt that they've moved on past that era. And we're starting that journey now. I think it's been 8 years since I started doing HDR, and that's when 600 nits was HDR. So I get it when people say 1,000 nits is all we need. I thought it was the end all be all at 600 nits. I was like, wow, I got 6 times brighter, more color. I mean, holy cow, look at the skin tone. Wow, that's so beautiful. And then I graded content on a 20,000 nit processing system. That changed my relationship with storytelling. So I was like, wait a second. And I was a freelancer at that point. And I was like, oh my gosh. Okay, I need to get in this stuff. So you tell the story to yourself. If you're in the future where the description that I just said is the reality, what's clear is there's a lot more to learn about storytelling at these levels, but I think more importantly, and what's fundamentally going to be needed, is to control those images. And today, Dolby Vision, and with its metadata, that's how you do it. And that's why I work for Dolby. It's what will responsibly enable the next wave of storytelling experience. And I say responsibly, not lightly, because you want to control those environments. And HDR10 and those other formats, they just don't control it like Dolby Vision does. And Dolby Vision's young. It's going to grow, and it's going to have a lot more, hooks and things for you to tell better stories. But it's got the head start, and it's definitely the premium experience today. But it should become ubiquitous at some point. And I wanted to be a part of that from the moment I learned about it, in that moment. So, that's, if it hasn't come across, I'm kind of passionate about it. And I'm not trying to be like, oh, Dolby Vision, but to me, it's really the only format that I would really trust my most prized images with, and know that as I'm pushing them down to even the lowest performing tier TVs, that it's handling it, and those are my choices, not some TV manufacturer's adaptation of my choices. So where do I see it heading? Maybe the holodeck, and then hopefully past it.
Well, cool. Shane, it's been really great to talk to you. This has been really interesting. I'm glad that you were able to make the time to talk to me. So if anyone wants to get in contact with you or see your work, where could they check you out?
I've got some work, not in HDR, at shanemario.com.
And also, you should probably mention you put together this great website. You mentioned a little bit earlier, languageofhdr.com, which has some really good info on storytelling in general with HDR.
Well, thank you. I was taking some kind of past notes, and I was collecting my notebooks, and I realized that I had all these various notes on interacting and working with HDR, and I started talking with some people at Dolby and even outside of Dolby, and they were like, you really should just put a site up there and like maybe, get the talk going, and if people want to look at it, great, you have something to refer to. So I was like, okay, I'll put it up there. And so really a lot of it is just notes of like, how do you think we might use and talk about HDR and work with HDR, and what is HDR, and just the concepts of it as we had kind of worked with it kind of over the years. I appreciate you looking at this site. It actually does have a lot of pictures from the days of, I recreated the pictures, because how I learned about HDR was I took my luminance meter and I went out and I just started measuring the world to understand what the real light luminance levels were. Like, I didn't know. I knew how to take things in the reality and push them into the 100-nit box, but I didn't know where they were supposed to be for a 4,000 nits or 10,000 nit storytelling, right? Like, sure. Where should they be? If I wanted to recreate that moment, where would they be, and what would be the ratio? So I went out and shot a bunch of the images of very similar images that I shot in the early days. I couldn't find the old original ones, but I kind of recreated them. It's shocking of how bright the reality is versus where you stick them in a 100-nit box, in a 100-nit story. It was fun. It was a fun project to work on, and I hope people contribute to it, and it's not the definitive answer to everything, but I think it's a starting point.
But it's a start, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, cool. Thanks again.
Thank you for having me, Josh. It's been really great.